Well, thank you so much for coming. This is kind of a, um, a seductive title for our panel. It's very interesting. Got a little bit of Twitter chatter too. So the title. So I'll get to that soon. But this conference is about children, and a lot has happened since David. You were part of an update of the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, in 2011.
Yes.
And that was meant, the update then was meant to address what was this emerging but fast-growing advertising economy. And here we are in 2019. What changes do you think need to be made? Do there need to be updates, perhaps yet again, to COPPA? What do you see as the big holes that in 2011 you folks did not see coming now?
I think we saw what is going on today coming. The question is whether COPPA gives the FTC adequate authority to really protect kids in this market. And the answer is decidedly no. COPPA covers only a small segment of the app market. It's apps that are directed at kids. So the general sites that kids 12 and under go to are certainly tracking online these users. Now, they may not know their kids, right? Because many of them will have a policy buried in the terms of service saying, our site isn't for kids, even though it's a gaming site that is highly used by 12 and under children. So there's no parental permission. There is no real way for parents to necessarily understand what data is being collected. And it may not be segmented. The data may not be segmented based on age. But that information is being captured. It may well be sold. It may be resold. Given the ad-driven basis of these platforms and these companies, the data is being used. And COPPA, you can't fault Congress in 1999 for not having the crystal ball that would have forecast the development of this kind of economy. But the statute needs to be overhauled. The FTC, I think, did what it could back in 2010 to 2012 to modernize the rule. But the rule is constrained by statute. And the actual knowledge standard that a website needs to have actual knowledge that 12 and unders are using the site is a real problem, as are many other aspects of COPPA. So it was a great statute back in 1998. It was a forward-looking statute back in 1998, but a lot has changed. And the statute is not kept up with the dynamic industry that the FTC is supposed to regulate.
So actual knowledge as well as apps that are directed to kids, those are two big sort of filters.
Those are two huge filters which, by and large, exclude general purpose websites. So I think it was Common Sense Media that did a survey of parents on Fortnite, right? Kids on Fortnite. And it is not a kids-directed site, therefore it is not COPPA compliant. I can't believe they're not monetizing the information they collect. That's their business model. So I'm not blaming Fortnite. They're probably in compliance with the law. But that sort of is an example of where the law's shortcomings today. And so, the truth of the matter is COPPA now applies only to sites like the Disney site or some of the sites that are really aimed at 12 and unders.
Absolutely.
And, and Congress is going to have to make a decision about whether general purpose sites have any obligation at all to 12 and unders or their parents.
So forgive me, Common Sense and audience, we could do a whole panel just on Fortnite, by the way. But I will have to stop because I've got a 12-year-old son and I'm living the pain right now. But forgive me because I did not introduce properly our great panelists. We have David Vladeck from Georgetown Law School, former head of consumer protection at the FTC. Next to him, we have Franklin Foer, who's at the Atlantic. He wears many hats, one of them being a very important nonfiction writer, excuse me. Where he writes books, nonfiction.
You know what? We like to keep that distinction
That is a wall. That is a wall. All these folks can carry many hats. Nicol Turtley, who is now at Brookings, but who has worked on issues of inclusion and digital equity for many years, and who's a prominent voice in that field. So let me start again from then. We'll come back to COP, but let me just step back for a second. Frank, let's just ask the obvious question. These are free. These are free services. People love free. I love free. This is actually the best defense that the companies have. Like, you can just not use my app. It's free. What's the harm here? Explain what.
Well, I think that when we talk about data, which is such a bloodless term, I mean, it's really, data sounds inert, but data is actually as intimate as it gets, because as these companies with their pack rat servers collect every shard of information about us, disposing of none of it because the cost of keeping it on their servers is so low, they manage to acquire this incredibly intimate portrait of the inside of our brain. They get this cartography of our psyche. And in the course of mapping our psyche, they're able to understand the things that give us pleasure, the things that give us anxiety. They acquire this deep emotional understanding of the way that we work as human beings. And that becomes the basis for manipulation. You know, I wake up every morning thanking God that I have daughters who are not addicted to Fortnite, because I don't actually know how, as a parent, I would be able to navigate something like that, which has become so socially acceptable. I mean, it is social media for middle school boys, right? And it exists in this way in which it has become so ubiquitous that parents, I think, feel helpless in the face of it, because it's the way in which their kids maintain this network of connections. It becomes this theater for them to establish their relationships with their peers. And yet all parents kind of have this sneaking sense that it's probably not a good idea for their kids to be on a first-person shooter game for endless periods of time, yet they don't know the pathway for escape. And kids themselves, of course, are helpless in this, and they're being manipulated into this world. It is not, you make the choice to get onto the platform, but once you're on the platform, you get stuck in this kind of this endless feedback mechanism. As the sites begin to know you better, it becomes harder, and as it becomes more and more part of the furniture of your life, the prospect of escape becomes harder and harder. And that's why everything we're talking about is both, it's both a matter for policy. We can insist that parents do better. We can insist that we as individuals model better behavior for our children. But there's a certain point where, as consumers and as individuals in this world, we're helpless and we need protection. Thus, I think you do have to appeal to this higher power of the state to come in and take much more radical action than we're even considering now.
Absolutely. I will say that there is a girl equivalent that's called Instagram. So so I hear this a lot.
Write an apocalyptic book about tech and try to scare the crap out of your kids, and that's like my parenting strategy.
Do it fast.
Yeah.
So in my conversations with folks at the FTC, actually, I do feel like there are certain legal rubrics that they have to work within, and a lot of that is proving harm. And you're right, there's such a benign term, sort of like a bloodless term, as you say, a very, just a very bland term, data. And it's kind of hard to get your head around it. So proving harms is a big thing. I have a twofold question for you, Nicol. Like, where do you see the harms? Can you put some meat on the bones there? And how can you make sure that this conversation is inclusive?
Mm-hmm. So since we're talking about Fortnite, I do have to say I have a 12-year-old girl who plays Fortnite.
Yeah, yeah.
Just to be clear, girls play it too, David, and they play pretty well.
See, I
Just
think
letting you know.
it's a mark of superiority, gender superiority that.
Yeah, the boys call my
girls
daughter
don't.
when they're ready to play Fortnite. Put that on the record, and I will show her the tape. So I think, Cecilia, your question is actually really interesting, right? Because to David's point, I think we're in this stage of where technology has really moved from something that was much more static and, based on email and these very static conversations to something that's much more transactional, to something that is much more opaque, right? The things that people do on the internet, their footprint is so wide that they can't often understand where their data is sort of flowing. It's almost like the expansive space of the ocean, right? And the deeper that you get into the internet, the more your data has touch points that become unidentifiable. So if you're ever in the ocean and the deeper you go, the less oxygen you have. It's almost like what consumers are facing today when it comes to the privacy debate. And so what does that mean? I mean, obviously it has implications for young people who, if we take the example of middle school kids on Fortnite, I have a 16-year-old who's on highly encrypted services right now that I can't even go in and tell you what his conversations were, or sites that uncurate or unsave images. So whereas me as a parent, I can't go and actually track what that conversation is. That's the new world of technology. And I would say that all of us who are adults, we participate in this too. Technology has given us certain affordances, certain conveniences, where this two-sided market of the internet in terms of the ad-supported model has made it very comfortable for us to give up that information in return for it being free. So where do the harms then show up? I think the conversation that we're talking about now has moved to, I think, the state of play that we're all talking about up here and that many of you recognize. The state of play is how data is being not only collected, how it's also being harvested, stored, and shared. And that is where it becomes much more difficult to sort of set these guardrails and to define what harm is. There are very discrete harms that come from this new fuel of the data economy. Those harms can be portrayed by people being surveilled when their data is available. We can see that. The FTC for a very long time dealt with deceptive practices in terms of the profiling of certain consumers of products and services that were sort of defined by this profile of their meta tag, right? That's an issue. Other areas where people get harmed by technology is around bias, when people are profiled in places that are discriminatory or generate discriminatory effect. Employment algorithms do that now. Housing, healthcare, et cetera, we're seeing that actually more and more. Harm related to your inability to have any control over the types of outputs and ads that you get. Early on, about 5 or 6 years ago, the FTC held a big data workshop. Because I tell people, we've been talking about this for a long time. Just 5 years ago, it was called big data, right? It's really not, it's just different terms, right? But LaTanya Sweeney, who was the chief technology officer at the time, she showed this demonstration of a black fraternity's website. It was a 100th year anniversary, the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. And as we watched it, she told us, as we were sitting in a room like this, just watch the screen. And as we watched the screen, ads came up for get your arrest record and the highest interest credit cards. Now, if you were to replace a black fraternity with young people, ads may pop up that, again, are very predatory. If you replace that with seniors, ads may pop up that are predatory. And so I think the FTC really has a challenge on their hands to deal with this opaque, inferential, data-dense internet that is sort of defining, I think, this fluid nature of how we interact in ways that we don't have guardrails as we've had before to sort of pull down on some of those things. But we have guardrails when it comes, and I just testified before the Hill. We've got guardrails when it comes to non-discrimination. Those are clear. There are things that you just can't do on the internet that actually continue to push systemic discrimination into the online space. But sometimes it's hard to define what those are. Right. And that leads to the inclusivity of the space, which Cecilia talked about. So David talks about technology as the furniture. Some of us are sitting on luxury couches. There are some people who are on benches. And there are some people who are actually sitting on the floor. Now, we still have a digital divide in this country. We have 13% of Americans that do not have access They're disproportionately people of color, they're older Americans, they're people with disabilities, they're non-foreign born, or they're foreign born residents. And they sit on the other side of the digital divide. And what makes it more interesting, and a shameless plug, I'm writing a book about this. I know common sense, to tell you the truth. I was about to say I'm writing a book on this because I'm old, but I know common sense because I still have on my refrigerator from 15 years ago the practices for my kids of how they're supposed to operate the internet. But over my 15 plus years working in this space, I'm very curious about what this new digital divide is creating. Because as we see the technology become much more robust, changing the way that we live, learn, and earn, we're not only going to have a divide where people just generally don't have access, right? The binary digital divide. You're online, you're not offline. But if you don't have a credit card, you can't participate in the sharing economy. If you're not understanding algorithms and how they guide you towards certain products and services, you will fall victim to that divide. It's not just a deployment issue. It's how is that technology in some ways affecting your behaviors, and what is the cost of exclusion from something that actually gives you lots of benefits, whether it's economic or elsewhere. So I would just say to your question, I agree with all the panelists. The internet of today doesn't look like the one in the 90s. It probably will not look like the one, in 2050 or 2060. So how do we actually keep our kids safe? But then how do we also manage an environment that grows in ways that we're also, I don't want to say predicting, but understanding how that growth impacts on human and civil liberties.
So a lot to unpack there. That was great. David, let's talk a little bit. We talked a little bit about the limits in legislation that allows the FTC to do what it does. Given what the tools that the FTC does right now, let's just talk about how they're enforcing. So there was a record COPPA enforcement action recently against TikTok, otherwise known as Musical.ly, about $6 million. So it was a record. Though I think the first thing that the sort of reaction to that was, that's such a drop in the bucket for a multi-billion-dollar company. So how can you meaningfully, number one, what is your assessment of how the FTC is enforcing? But how can you also meaningfully change behavior of companies through fines or through potentially behavioral remedies?
So let's take a step back.
Yeah.
In COPPA cases, the agency actually does have authority to level civil penalties. But in most privacy cases, the agency does not have initial fining authority. So if you're a polluter and the EPA catches you, the EPA can assess a penalty. The FTC generally cannot until a company is already under order. With respect to COPPA enforcement, it's very hard. I mean, not only is the universe of apps limited by the statute, but the agency is a small agency. It does have a forensic unit, but it doesn't really have the bandwidth to look at the thousands and thousands and thousands of apps that are out there, which is why Commissioner Chopra started talking about networks that would help the FTC identify non-COPPA compliant apps developed aimed at kids. The agency has brought quite a number of COPPA cases. And generally what it tries to do is target, like the last target, big, sort of big apps that are affecting lots of kids because the resources the agency has are small. So Google has more lawyers than the FTC has staff. The staff of the FTC is 2/3 of what it was 30 years ago. When I ran the Bureau of Consumer Protection, the most we ever had was 440 FTEs, and we had to not only worry about privacy and COPPA, but the agency enforces 70 statutes beyond the Federal Trade Commission Act. And so the resources the agency can reasonably devote to COPPA enforcement is quite small.
Yeah.
And particularly given the other serious problems on the web. And we talked about many of them. Defining harm is a very difficult problem. The exceptions to COPPA make it difficult. I mean, there's many companies that are collecting tons of information of kids who are not covered by COPPA. So, I think the agency, and then of course you have the exception for those companies who are part of the safe harbor. And that is a serious, serious issue because many of the big app developers are part of safe harbor programs. So it is a difficult issue for the agency. I think the agency has tried to send a signal to the significant app developers that if we catch you engaging in COPPA-like practices, the agency will find you and ultimately give you a fine. Now, how civil penalties are calculated are very problematic because they're based on historic values. And the FTC 5 years ago had a statutory increase in the civil penalties that were available. When I was there, it was $16,000 per violation. A violation, we multiplied by everyone affected by it. Now it's $48,000. But in setting a civil penalty, there has to be some proportionality to prior penalties. And so you'll see this latter effect as the agency engages in COPPA enforcement. But civil penalties are a deterrent, but they're not going to, in my view, push for widespread compliance when the companies know the odds of getting caught are not very high.
So what would change behavior?
Well, with respect to kids' apps, I think you need a much more robust statute that gives the agency much better tools. The actual knowledge standards is a real problem. As the commissioner made clear, the safe harbor problem is a safe problem. There ought to be an individual right of action for parents whose children have been tracked unlawfully. There are lots of things that Congress could do. I'm not sure they'll ever get around to doing any of this, that would allow for more robust enforcement of this.
Yeah,
of this
right
law.
of action is sort of what all those lawyers are going to push back against.
Yeah,
But
can
go
I
ahead.
just make one other comment about manipulation? I mean, to me, one of the serious problems is the power of these tools to really sort of push children into particular behaviors. And so about 11 years ago, the agency finished up its last food marketing report to Congress about marketing foods to children 12 and under. One of the things that was disturbing about that report was the psychological testing the companies were doing on young children, including brain imagery and all this. They weren't doing this for like a school experiment or something. They were figuring out how to best to market to kids. A problem that the government faces is that one person's manipulation is another person's persuasion. And the First Amendment definitely allows people to try to persuade anybody, including kids. But the power of the manipulation, of the marketing, every company that is marketing to kids has platoons of social scientists. They are doing very sophisticated research about what buttons to push when and how. And one of the things I've urged the FTC to do is take a deep dive into the marketing practices of these companies. Why are they so powerful tools? Why do kids get addicted to these products? It's not accidental. But until we have a sort of a record that we can present to Congress about how this marketing takes place, what are the tools the marketers use, it's going to be very hard to get Congress really
there's a
interested.
whole.
Can I kind of respond to that?
Yeah, but then I'll go to Frank. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say on the manipulation, David, you have a good point. And I think what is more complicated about today's environment is artificial intelligence is tapping into deep learning and neural programming. And so whereas before the studies used to say, okay, if a kid, before they could talk, saw a McDonald's sign, that they were like, McDonald's, before they could say mama or dada. What technology has done is that it taps into this rubric of your mental psychosis to actually figure out what you have, what you like. And that's where I think the plethora of data actually helps that, right? Because technology companies are collecting your likes, your dislikes, your interests, your preferences, your network of friends. And if you apply that to young people, what used to be a common practice of, identifying brands to logos is now a feeling related and associated with that marketing. The challenge with Congress actually taking this on is that they just don't know enough. And I would suggest, as a sociologist, it's not always the social scientists that are actually playing in this game either. as a social scientist, I have a particular respect towards human subjects and have to go through a review process before I write a study. With the technology space, it is a rush to market. Who can get the next app? Who can get the next product? Who can actually push something out in a way that's actually going to continue to sort of increase those engagements? And unfortunately, young people who do not have a lot of these safeguards of parents who understand the technology, which is why we have groups like Common Sense, right? Kids that can decipher between what is good and bad marketing, we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, clearly with the election interference example, I probably tell people I probably shared something too, just simply because, not because I'm not technologically astute, but because it appealed to something in my psyche that I was probably going through at the moment, or might have been part of the conversations I might have been having. And so I think, to your point, it will be very difficult for the FTC or any legislator to sort of put their hands around it until we know more about the technology and we have these cross-collaborative conversations that involve policymakers and academics and technologists and civil society groups to sort of break down what those implications are.
Yeah, there certainly is a gap of knowledge. You see that in all the hearings as well.
Right, exactly.
So can we get to
I wasn't going to say that on tape, right? Trying to remain friendly,
I
but
guess I can. Frank, can we talk about the business models a little bit? But talk about whatever you like. But let's talk about the,
No, because I do think, the business model is at the heart of it because it's, as David said, the business model is manipulation, but it's the way in which these platforms have, they bestride the economy, and that if you participate in the public square, the marketplace, you invariably depend on the platform companies. And since their primary values are manipulation, it trickles out so that everybody else who interacts with them assimilates those values. And so you take something like Facebook, where you see the Russians stepping in and exploiting the manipulation machine that is Facebook. Well, the Russians were doing what we in journalism do all the time. We're exploiting Facebook by trying to, tap into that audience. And journalists play by Facebook's rules in the way that we write headlines, the way that we take the data to figure out which stories we should assign. And so these, it's really, it is endemic to the platform. And I do think that I agree with David, the analogy to food, which I think is an extremely powerful one in the ways in which we've thanks in part to Michelle Obama and other efforts, we kind of have this greater sense of the ways in the FTC, the greater sense of the ways in which food has been reverse engineered in order to tap into kind of the reptilian parts of our brains in order to make us crave things, and the ways in which our palates have been altered over time, and the ways in which we see something that can be the source of pleasure and nourishment get weaponized into a source of addiction and becomes the source of massive social plagues. The same thing obviously happens here. And I think one of the interesting things with food is how you see, I think there's a much more concerted effort to try to kind of weaponize kids at a very early age to understand the addictive powers of food, the importance of thinking in a conscious sort of way about how to consume and to eat. And I keep thinking that at the earliest age, we need to explain to children that this world that they're inhabiting is filled with these invisible forces which are manipulative and addictive. And I think one thing that's powerful for any parent is when you get shamed by your child for when that moment when your device takes you away from your kid. Sure. And if we can kind of weaponize our kids to kind of shame us as parents and maybe shame us into, I think it's one powerful feedback loop we could create.
Absolutely. I think we're going to move to Q&A now, but some of that manipulation on headlines, Frank wrote a book about this, actually. And his experience, up close to this. And I think we'll have a mic going around. Thank you.
I'm with the Montgomery County PTA, just like Lisa here. There's a few of us here. And I just wanted to share a very small story and then a question. It took us 2 years to get from Montgomery County the Google Terms of Use, which first graders were clicking through. Took the parents 2 years to get that. And this is a terms of use where Google owns some of the data, and we see that it's going to be used later on for artificial intelligence. My quick question is, many of us have testified before the Montgomery County Board of Education multiple times, and we feel like we're talking to a brick wall. They don't want to hear it. I don't know if they read the newspaper, but I'm sure that they do. But my question is, when educators could be leaders in this space, I don't understand how they could block us, because many of us keep our kids away from tech, and we can't do that in the school. The school is running counter to all the science, and we just don't understand that. Maybe someone can explain if the Department of Education has any teeth in this area, or why the schools are doing this.
So there is a federal statute that governs the use of technology in the classroom, even in law schools. And Google has been out there. My guess is, I don't know this for certain, is the software is being provided by Google for, quote, free. This is sort of the heart of this whole conversation. And FERPA does put all sorts of restrictions on use, but it would not, for example, forbid the use of anonymized data for all sorts of machine learning tools, for all sorts of other things that ultimately will benefit Google in the long run. I don't know why you were denied access to the terms of service, because the terms of service, they should have been available on the web. But they're basically, they're sort of standard terms of service, which is Google's going to keep this data, right? I mean, it may be your children's homework, it may be test scores, it may be, lesson plans, it may be email. Georgetown's email is covered by FERPA. But they're going to make use of the data, and they're going to commercialize whatever, whatever results yield from that.
And if I could just quickly respond. So I've spoken to two groups, one of them being the National School Board Association, just in the last couple of weeks. I think it is important that educators are at the table of any of these discussions. Educators, as well as librarians, play a role in closing the digital divide. The weaponization that David talked about is happening, yes, to all kids, but to poor minority kids, it's happening more. And when their data is weaponized, it keeps them in places where they cannot use access as a trajectory to success. So we have to figure out ways to carve out what I've been calling like this community infrastructure. People who are players in that space that see people every day and see how technology is actually being used to, either help a teacher or in places where we may need to lock down on the use of technology because of the potential harms. It goes back to Cecilia's question earlier. How do we identify harms? Well, we definitely can't do it in the Beltway by ourselves. We have to do it in partnership with actual practitioners that are sitting at the table. So you keep going back to that council meeting, and you keep talking to people until they recognize that you have a seat at the table. Because I trust you more in the harvesting of how my kid's data is being used than myself as a parent, who often I don't know, right, when I'm sitting in my house. So yeah, I would just say don't give up. The more voices that are in these discussions around privacy and what federal legislation looks like, the more we're going to have inclusive frameworks, and we're going to nuance certain parts of legislation that some folks won't get, just simply because they are not really vested the way that people like you are.
Can I just weigh in here for 1 second, which is that what's curious is that the digital divide is taking on this new dimension, which is that in the most affluent school districts and schools, you have the techlash arriving.
Yeah.
And
Give it to my kids.
I'll
take it. Give me put all that tablets in the butt, and I'll take it.
But
to
so
the
what
school.
you have is then you have an elite that's being trained to kind of fend against manipulation, and then you have the tech companies themselves kind of. There was a story in the Times about Google in Baltimore and the ways in which they're trying to, so you'll have this idea that you have an elite that is able to protect itself against addiction, and then kind of the rest of the country that is being aggressively addicted.
Right.
Right.
There was a story by Nellie Bowles, my colleague, just another plug, recently about this. This is a good question. Okay, is privacy versus free, meaning no money, a false choice? Is there a way for consumers to get free products and access to services without paying with their privacy? I mean, is there a middle ground? These companies are not going to go away. Yeah. Is there something that could change? Anyone?
Well, we did, when I was at the FTC, we did a lot of work with consumers asking that precise question. So one question was asked is, if you could do Google searches for a penny and Google would not collect your data, would you pay the penny? And surprisingly to me, most people didn't want to pay a penny. They liked the free service. And if you started ratcheting it up to a nickel or a dime, virtually no one said, yes, I would exchange that. And these were not people who were ignorant about what Google was doing with the data. They were quite sophisticated. They knew that Google was going to use these to formulate ads that would show up on their screen whenever they were on the net. So, my own view is there are ways of, so there have to be some, I think, government restraints on what free is and what you're exchanging. I mean, you said earlier, and it's a great thing to say, which is data sounds inert. But the truth is, data is flowing everywhere. There are no real government restraints on selling and continuing to use data once you've acquired it. So data shows up all over the place, and data has a value only collectively, right? My browsing history is valueless, but collectively our browsing history is worth a lot of money. And so somehow or another we need to change the dynamic here, because the only choice consumers have is submit or don't use the service.
Right.
It's an all or nothing bargain, which is no bargain at all. And that's the problem with today's market.
We'll take another question, just so we can make. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, on David's point, the world in which I live that's why we need federal privacy legislation. That's why we need these guardrails that sort of define what are baseline protections for people and give people an opportunity to have some type of, and I'm not going to say which err on which side, but some type of consent on how they want their data used and where they want that data to be, if it's repurposed, or if it's minimized. And that's a discussion I think will provide at least some clearer expectations of data use and what people are getting into. The bottom line is when we go into a grocery store, they say, can I have your number, please? May I have your email to send? We've been doing this type of activity for a very long time, my friends. The question is, based on everything that we've talked about and these potential risk factors, we do have to do better protection and modernize laws to apply to the new space. But I think we're seeing overwhelming support, I think, among tech companies and non-tech companies in different sectors to at least start to have that conversation, which will at least provide some baseline protections where we're not sitting here trying to always figure out, well, where should we apply privacy, where should we not? Let's have some principles, or if not norms, to at least give people some baseline consideration of how we want our data to be used.
Next question, please, from the audience. Yes.
Yes, Ed Green. I'm from the Hispanic Information and Telecommunications Network in Brooklyn. And we're currently involved in a digital storytelling initiative with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, their Bureau of Youth Initiatives and Diversion. And it's a way for young people to talk about how they are perceiving what's impacting them, as opposed to being the subjects of all of the news and information about what's bad that's happening to them. So one of the problems is that with the short form video that we're using to help them tell these stories, we can't share them because of the privacy. And so we do a closed session with that. So I'm just sort of wondering, are there any other spaces and places where the amplification of youth voices are being put to use around some of the issues that we're talking about, and that Common Sense Media actually provides some very good materials for them to use to create those kinds of conversations?
Well, I would just say on this, kudos to you and the great work that you're doing. Digital storytelling has been around for a long time, and the more kids are actually are able to tell their voices. Prior to my career in policy, I worked for a group called One Economy, which is actually where I met Common Sense Media, and we used to give kids flip devices to actually do digital storytelling way before any of these other problems emerged, right? It was a really simple time then, right? I would say, what we used was general consent and really engaging the parents around the fact that we're using their kids to tell these stories. Being able to have just good hygiene about the places that you post. There are great youth communities now. Listen, folks, outside of all of the doom and despair that we just actually piled on you, there are great uses of technology. There are wonderful cases where technology are transforming the way people think about communities, how they think about precision agriculture, medicine. We gotta balance it out, because we're gonna lose that. But so I would say that look for those spaces where kids are actually convening. In DC, for example, there are groups like Rightopia that are bringing kids together around narrative. They use web-based communities. They share, and I think the common sense link is do it responsibly and be aware of how you're actually getting kids involved with this digital space.
So here's a question from online. Did you? Okay, last one. What most worries you about how legislators are talking about privacy reforms currently? Where might consumers lose out where they think they are winning? Good question.
I would say that the danger is that you have Mark Zuckerberg begging for regulation right now.
Yeah. What did you think of that?
And that when he's begging for regulation, it means he's going to shape it to injure the rest of us. And I think that we actually, so there's these two tracks that the tech debate is happening on in Washington, where you have a debate about competition and a debate about privacy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to learn from the debate about competition, where we've advanced to more radical solutions quickly. And so this idea of breaking up the tech companies, which a year ago would have been seemed naive or kind of far-fetched, is now, you have presidential candidates lining up to do it. I think that we need to treat privacy in the same sort of way, that it's an emergency, that people talk about, is it possible to save privacy as we've known it? And I think people say, no, it might not be. Maybe things have slipped away. And so if we are truly intent on preserving this thing that we call privacy, I think we actually need to think much more radically. We need to think about shattering the business models of these companies in the same sort of way that we talk about in the competition debate. And I don't think I've seen anything being proposed now. And I look at GDPR, which feels kind of useless to me ultimately. Maybe it's the framework for something more robust down the line. But I feel like we need to kind of really push the contours of the debate in a radical way.
Yeah, I would say for that question, I would say there are three things that we need to focus on. That what worries me is sort of like this lack of definition of what is privacy. What is it?
Yeah.
How are we defining it generally? And what are we trying to protect by bringing legislative guardrails to it? And I think if we start there, we might actually have a sense of where we're going with the legislation. I would also say because of the lack of definition around privacy, we've actually had this state-federal debate going on. And sort of because of David's concern, discussion around the urgency, that we're actually seeing this implosion between states and the federal government and who's going to get it first. And for this country, it makes no sense. That's the second thing. And then I think the third thing, and you are sort of hearing it from the FTC now, which are, and you referenced it, and I think we've referenced it, what are the harms that we're actually trying to appeal to? And if we can come up with, again, those use cases that are being weaponized first, those areas in between that we know are happening because of the intersection of how data actually flows and what happens to consumers, in areas potentially that we cannot predict, but we know are going to come down the line. That will give us some type of baseline for how we actually look at privacy legislation. That keeps me up at night because what we see are different conversations of what's important to different people. And this is probably, and this is why I kind of push back against putting antitrust competition conversations in with privacy. We've got to solve them separately because what we are talking about, I think, is a standard that American people want. This is something that we're also, as Zuckerberg is talking about it, I'm actually glad. I may not have, have different things about his concerns, but to see it actually talked about, whereas people who have been in telecom policy for a long time, we've never seen these issues talked about, at least brings attention to the fact that we need to have the conversation.
So let me be quick. I think that here's what worries me. I think that Congress always looks for the last best solution. And so far we've relied on a process that really believes in notice and choice. If you give people notice and give them people a choice, everything is fine. I think it's time to move away from that dynamic, that paradigm. I think we need a rights-based statute. In the United States, the only privacy right you have is against the government. There's some privacy towards, but basically, you don't have rights. And most of the rights-creating statutes we have don't really bestow rights on individuals. The second is, there are real harms out there that we need to address. And one of the things I am worried about is that's where Silicon Valley is going to really fight back.
Yeah.
And third is, we need to give people, individual people, rights to sue when their privacy has been violated. And all of those things, I think, would be toxic to the Silicon Valley platforms and giants that are going to be driving a lot of the legislative debate. So, I always get worried when Congress is in session. I think the United States is safest when the Supreme Court's on vacation and Congress is out of session. So I would much prefer to see the states percolate up for a while and see what kinds of alternatives are available before Congress takes
interesting.
final
We need
action.
Another panel.
This is good, and I like differing opinions. Thank you so much. We're totally out of town. We could go for another 2 things. Please thank David, Frank, and Nicole.
Thank you so much.